The clay tablets of Mesopotamia tell a different story from later traditions that portray gods as comforting figures, one that sits uncomfortably in the silence between prayers. The Anunnaki were not the gods you called upon for comfort. They were the gods you hoped would not call upon you. They appeared in the texts at moments of finality, when fates were decreed, when the dead were judged, when even a goddess could be condemned without appeal. In the most famous descent into the underworld, when Inanna, a major deity in her own right, violated the boundaries between life and death. It was the Anunnaki who sat in judgment. 7 figures, no mercy. The sentence was immediate. If even the gods could be tried and executed, what protection did mortals imagine they had? Tonight, we're exploring something the modern retellings rarely address. The Anunnaki were feared more than they were worshipped, not because the Mesopotamians misunderstood them, but because they understood them perfectly. These weren't benevolent patrons or cosmic parents. They were the divine council where outcomes were finalized, where destinies were assigned, where the dead were processed through an underworld that functioned less like hell and more like bureaucracy. Over the next chapters, we'll examine what the ancient sources actually say, not through the lens of modern alien theories, but through careful attention to Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts. We'll trace how the Anunnaki moved from being high-ranking gods to becoming synonymous with underworld judgment. We'll explore the concept of Malamu, that terrifying radiance that made divine presence physically overwhelming. And we'll ask why, despite their prominence in mythology, the Anunnaki had no major cult, no grand temples, no festivals in their honor. Before we descend deeper, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. The visuals are here to add atmosphere, but you can close your eyes and just listen. That's how this channel was designed. Thank you for being here. The sources for this story aren't hidden in conspiracy archives. They're sitting in museums, translated by scholars, available in academic databases. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Descent of Inanna, temple hymns and royal inscriptions, cylinder seals showing divine courts, underworld geographies mapped in cuneiform. The evidence has been here all along. It's just that we've been reading it with the wrong expectations. We expect ancient worship to mean affection, but Mesopotamian religion was built on something else entirely. The recognition that power, real, absolute cosmic power, is not safe to approach. So let's begin where all explorations of fear should begin, with the question of what exactly people were afraid of. Not monsters, not chaos, something stranger. They feared order. They feared the system. They feared the gods who made the rules and enforced them without exception. They feared the Anunnaki. And they had good reason. Mesopotamian religion was not designed for comfort. That's the first thing you need to understand if the Anunnaki are going to make sense. When we think of ancient gods, we often imagine benevolent figures who guide their people, protect cities, answer prayers in times of crisis. We think of devotion as something warm, reciprocal, a relationship. But here's what the historical record doesn't capture well: texture, the feel of a belief system, the emotional architecture underneath the ritual. Archaeologists can excavate temples. Linguists can translate hymns. We know which gods received offerings, which festivals mark the calendar, which kings claimed divine favor. What we can't excavate is the feeling in a person's chest when they spoke certain names, the hesitation, the weight. Fear doesn't fossilize, yet it shaped everything. In Mesopotamia, the divine realm wasn't imagined as a family. It was a court, not the kind where you plead your case and hope for mercy, the kind where decisions have already been reached before you arrive. The gods sat in council. They deliberated. They decreed. And once a decree was issued, it became shamtu, fate, finalized. The word appears across thousands of texts, always with the same legal weight. Not destiny in the romantic sense, not fortune or luck. Shamtu was an administrative term, a case closed, an entry recorded, a file processed and sealed, and the Anunnaki were the ones who processed it. But here's where the evidence becomes difficult to reconcile with standard religious models. Claim. 1. The jurisdictional problem. The temple hymn to Enlil, dated to approximately 2100 BCE during the Ur III period, is one of the most comprehensive surviving catalogs of divine authority in Mesopotamian literature. It's not poetic praise. It's an administrative document listing which God controlled what aspect of cosmic and terrestrial reality. 50 divine powers, called me, are distributed across the pantheon with bureaucratic precision. Inanna receives the me of warfare and sexual love. Enki holds the me of wisdom and fresh water. Nana controls the me of the moon and timekeeping. The list continues, allocating jurisdiction like a governmental charter. Each major deity receives a portfolio, a defined sphere of influence, a set of responsibilities and powers that no other god could usurp without consequence. The text states this explicitly. These are not symbolic associations. They are functional assignments. And the Anunnaki receive none, not individually, not collectively. Across the entire inventory of cosmic powers distributed in this and related texts, the Anunnaki as a group are never assigned a me. They appear in the mythological record constantly. They preside over the most significant moments in divine and mortal affairs. Yet in the divine organizational structure, they hold no official portfolio. This breaks the standard timeline of how we understand Mesopotamian theology. If the Anunnaki were simply high-ranking gods, as many early scholarly interpretations suggested, they would appear in these jurisdictional texts with clearly defined responsibilities. If they were minor gods, as later revisionist theories proposed, they wouldn't appear so prominently in major myths. But the evidence presents a third option that doesn't fit comfortably into either category. They appear everywhere in narrative. They appear nowhere in administrative allocation. The mainstream explanation for this absence has been that the Anunnaki were too numerous or too collectively conceptualized to warrant individual me assignments, that they functioned as a generic term for lower-tier deities who served the major gods. But this explanation fails upon closer examination of how individual Anunnaki are treated in other contexts. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, is consistently named as an Anunnaki in several sources. She holds a very specific domain. The underworld itself, with all its territories, gates, and inhabitants, falls under her jurisdiction. She has temples. She receives offerings. She exercises authority that other gods must negotiate with or respect. She has a me. She has a portfolio. But the Anunnaki, as the collective that judges alongside her, No such assignment exists. This suggests their power operated outside the standard divine economy. They weren't holders of authority distributed from above. They were enforcers of a system that predated the distribution itself. Think of a governmental structure where ministers hold specific departments, but there's a separate auditing body that reports to no single minister. They don't govern. They verify that governance is executed according to established protocol. The Anunnaki appear in the texts not as administrators, but as the administrative mechanism. This distinction matters because it changes the nature of fear associated with them. You don't fear a god of storms because the storm has a personality, preferences, ways to be appeased. You fear the storm because it follows meteorological patterns indifferent to your existence. The Anunnaki weren't feared because they were cruel. They were feared because they were systematic. But if they held no official jurisdiction in the distributed cosmic order, where did their power originate? The question sits uncomfortably in the evidence. We can document what they did. Judgment, decree, execution of sentence. We can trace where they appeared. Underworld courts, divine assemblies, moments of cosmic transition. We can count them. 7. Consistently across multiple sources and time periods. What we cannot find is the source document, the charter, the moment when their authority was established or defined. It's as if they were already functioning when the other gods received their assignments, already in place when the divine hierarchy crystallized into the form preserved in later texts. Already there, unnamed in early sources, processing the decrees that would later be attributed to named deities, which leads directly to the first piece of evidence that predates the mythological explanations. The answer requires looking at what they actually did in the texts, and, more importantly, what they were already doing before anyone wrote myths to explain them. Claim, Sartre 2, the Ration List Anomaly. The city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia has yielded some of the earliest written documents in human history. Among them are archaic ration lists dating to approximately 3200–3000 BCE, centuries before the great mythological cycles were composed. These aren't literary texts, they're accounting records. Ledgers tracking the distribution of bread, beer, and grain to various recipients within the temple economy. The tablets are small, dense, marked with proto-cuneiform signs that represent quantities and recipients. Most entries are straightforward. A named deity receives a specified amount. An, the sky god, receives offerings. Inanna receives offerings. Enki receives offerings. The pattern is consistent across hundreds of tablets, excavated from multiple archive contexts. Then, there are the anomalous entries. 7 rations allocated to the Anunnaki who decree, not to individual named gods, not to a variable group. 7 portions, marked with a term that already identifies them by their function. The deciders, the ones who issue judgments. This appears in administrative records before the Descent of Inanna was written, before the Epic of Gilgamesh mentioned them, before the elaborate mythological frameworks that modern readers encounter in translated anthologies. The bureaucratic apparatus already knew them, already allocated resources to them, already understood them as 7. This breaks the standard timeline because it suggests the Anunnaki didn't emerge from mythological storytelling. The stories tried to explain something that was already institutionally established. The seven-judge configuration wasn't invented by poets. It was recorded by accountants. The mainstream explanation treats these ration entries as placeholder terms for generic lesser deities who received communal offerings, that the number 7 here is coincidental or symbolic rather than literal, that specific names would have been used if specific gods were intended. But this explanation fails when you trace the consistency across time. The 7-unit allocation for the Anunnaki who decree remains fixed across 15 centuries of administrative records. Through the early dynastic period, through the Akkadian Empire, through the Ur-Ithri Renaissance, through the Old Babylonian period, the number never varies. The designation never changes. If these were simply minor gods receiving group rations, we would expect regional variation. Different cities would allocate different amounts. Different periods would show different configurations. The evidence shows the opposite. Extreme consistency, the kind of consistency you see in structural requirements, not cultural preferences. 7 rations, 7 recipients, 7 judges. The pattern holds regardless of which dynasty controls the region or which specific gods dominate local worship. It reads less like worship and more like compensation, payment for services rendered, regular allocation to personnel performing a necessary function. The same way a temple might allocate rations to scribes, doorkeepers, or singers. The Anunnaki appear in these ledgers not as objects of devotion, but as components of an operational system, which raises a question the texts never explicitly answer. Compensation for what service? The ration lists don't explain. They simply record. 7 portions distributed at regular intervals to the collective that decrees. The lists don't tell us what decrees were issued. They don't tell us where the 7 figures resided. They don't tell us how one became part of this group or whether the membership ever changed. They only confirm that by the time writing itself emerged, someone was already keeping track of them, already ensuring they received their allocation, already treating their function as essential to the maintenance of cosmic and social order. And here's what makes the evidence particularly unsettling. These are not sacred texts. These are not hymns or prayers or mythological narratives designed to inspire awe or communicate theological principles. These are inventory management documents, dry, procedural, written by temple administrators, tracking resource distribution. The fact that the Anunnaki appear here, in this context, suggests their role was understood as fundamentally administrative rather than devotional. You don't allocate rations to abstract concepts. You allocate rations to entities that require regular provisioning. The text treats them as present, active, and necessary. Not as mythological figures from distant realms, but as ongoing participants in a system that needed to function continuously. Too organized to be myth, too strange to be history. The record documents their existence before it explains their nature. It tracks their provisions before it tells their stories. And when the stories do emerge in later centuries, they consistently describe the same configuration. 7 figures, judging collectively, decreeing fates, executing sentences. The myths didn't invent the Anunnaki. The myths tried to make sense of what the administrative records had been tracking all along. But compensation for what service? The answer requires looking at what they actually did when the literary texts began describing their activities, and the first detailed description is more explicit than anything the ration lists preserve. It's a trial record, a divine prosecution, an execution carried out with procedural precision, and the defendant was a goddess. Claim 3. The Execution Protocol. The Descent of Inanna is one of the most studied texts in Mesopotamian literature. Multiple versions survive, copied and recopied across centuries, translated from Sumerian into Akkadian, preserved in both temple libraries and scribal schools. Most modern readers encounter it as a mythological narrative about death and resurrection. A goddess descends to the underworld, dies, and is eventually restored to life through negotiation and substitution. But Tablet 7th of the Old Babylonian version, catalogued as CBS 15285 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains something that standard retellings rarely emphasize: a trial transcript. Lines 215 through 222 describe the Anunnaki's judgment of Inanna using vocabulary that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian divine mythology. The text doesn't say they killed her. It doesn't say they destroyed her. It uses dikud, a compound term meaning judgment cut. The severing of a legal case, the conclusion of a proceeding, followed immediately by namtar, fate decree, the formal pronunciation of sentence. These are not poetic terms. They are legal, technical vocabulary used in actual Mesopotamian court records when describing the moment a judge finalizes a verdict. Scribes used dikud when documenting property disputes, criminal trials, and administrative hearings. It appears in thousands of mundane legal tablets alongside witness lists, evidence summaries, and compensation calculations. And here it is, applied to divine execution. The text describes the Anunnaki fastening the eye of death upon Inanna, turning her into a corpse, hanging her body on a hook. The violence is absolute, but the language surrounding the violence is procedural, formulaic, as if transcribing an event that followed established protocol rather than depicting spontaneous divine wrath. This breaks the standard timeline of how divine punishment functions in ancient Near Eastern mythology. When Marduk kills Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, the text describes a battle, strategy, weapons, physical confrontation, dismemberment of the defeated chaos goddess to create the cosmos. It's violent, but it's combat. When Enlil unleashes the flood in the Atrahasis epic, it's a decision made in divine council, but the execution is environmental catastrophe, not legal procedure. No trial vocabulary appears in those contexts. No dikud, no namtar, no procedural language suggesting the violence followed judicial protocol. But with the Anunnaki and Inanna, every step reads like court documentation. She arrives, they assemble, they look upon her, they speak the word against her, they execute the decreed fate. The sequence is formulaic, repeatable, as if this was one instance of a process that occurred regularly, not a unique mythological event. The mainstream explanation treats this as poetic parallelism. The ancient storytellers, familiar with legal proceedings from their own experience, projected that structure onto divine events to make them comprehensible to human audiences. The legal language is metaphorical, a way of communicating divine authority through familiar institutional frameworks. But this explanation fails when you examine what gets the legal treatment and what doesn't. Eras plague across Mesopotamia in the Hera epic, no trial language. Ishtar's revenge against Gilgamesh, no procedural framing, Nergal's invasion of the underworld, no judicial vocabulary. Divine violence appears constantly throughout Mesopotamian mythology, but only the Anunnaki's actions are described using the specific terminology of court proceedings. The pattern isn't about making divine action comprehensible. It's about documenting a specific type of divine action that functioned differently from all others. The Anunnaki weren't mythic enforcers who acted on emotion or strategy. They were the judicial apparatus itself. And what makes this particularly significant is that we have comparison texts. We know what Mesopotamian legal records looked like because thousands survive. We can see how scribes documented trials, sentencings, executions. The Anunnaki sections match that documentation exactly. They don't improvise. They don't debate. They don't show mercy or cruelty. They assemble. They observe. They pronounce. 7 figures performing a function that appears mechanical in its consistency. And the text treats this as unremarkable, as expected. As if anyone familiar with how divine judgment worked would recognize the procedure immediately. Inanna's crime was trespassing, entering a realm she had no authority to enter, violating territorial jurisdiction between the world of the living and the world of the dead. In Mesopotamian legal thought, this would constitute a boundary violation, a transgression against established order, and boundary violations required formal adjudication, not because the gods were fair or merciful, because the system required closure. An offense had been committed. The offense had to be processed. A verdict had to be reached. A sentence had to be executed. The legal infrastructure operated according to its own internal logic, indifferent to the identity of the defendant, even if the defendant was a major goddess, even if her death would create cosmic imbalance, even if her father Enki would eventually negotiate her partial release. None of that mattered at the moment of judgment. The Anunnaki didn't consider consequences. They processed the case before them, according to established procedure. The text doesn't say they struck her down. It says they executed the decreed fate, as if following a manual, as if referring to a protocol established long before this particular case, as if they had done this before and would do it again. Which raises the question the text never addresses. How many other cases had they processed? How many other defendants had stood before the 7 figures? How many other sentences had been pronounced using the same formulaic language? The Descent of Inanna preserves one instance, because it involved a goddess important enough to warrant a full mythological narrative. But the procedural nature of the description suggests this was routine, just another case in the underworld court system, just another fate decree executed according to protocol. The only reason we have a detailed account is because the defendant was extraordinary, but the process itself, that was ordinary, expected, the way divine judgment worked. And here's what makes the evidence impossible to dismiss. The text doesn't treat this as shocking. It doesn't present the Anunnaki's judgment as a dramatic deviation from normal divine behavior. It presents it as what obviously happens when someone violates the boundary between life and death. The shock in the narrative isn't that Inanna was judged. The shock is that she was later released. That part is extraordinary. That part requires elaborate negotiation and substitution. But the judgment itself, that's just what the Anunnaki do. The text assumes the reader understands this, assumes the seven-figure court assembly is familiar, assumes the procedural language needs no explanation. Which means this wasn't exotic theology. This was standard religious knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia. Everyone knew the Anunnaki judged. Everyone knew the procedure was final. Everyone knew that if you violated certain boundaries, you would be processed through that system, regardless of your status, identity, or relationships. The terror wasn't in the violence. The terror was in the certainty, the inevitability, the complete absence of exception or appeal. But the next piece of evidence suggests something even more disturbing. The Anunnaki didn't only judge the dead. Claim. Before, the living judgment record cylinder seals are among the most common archaeological artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia. Small stone cylinders carved with images and text, rolled across wet clay to create impressions for identification, authorization, or decoration. Thousands have been excavated. Most show standard iconography, gods in recognizable poses, kings receiving divine favor, worship scenes with altars and offerings. Vallier 243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, shows something different. The seal dates to the early dynastic Third period, approximately 2500 BCE. The carving depicts 7 seated figures arranged in a formal row. In front of them, a single human figure kneels, not prostrate in worship, not standing in honored audience, kneeling in the posture associated with supplication or judgment across dozens of other Mesopotamian visual sources. The 7 figures are not making offerings. They are not engaged in ritual. They are seated in the configuration associated with councils and courts. The kneeling figure faces them directly, and, critically, there is no altar visible, no cult paraphernalia, no indication this is a worship context. This breaks the standard timeline because it depicts the Anunnaki exercising judgment over a living human being, not in the underworld, not in the context of death, not as part of the afterlife processing that later theological traditions emphasized. This is terrestrial judgment, present tense, occurring in the world of the living. The mainstream explanation for seals like VA 243 is that they depict generic divine councils, that the 7-figure configuration, while suggestive, doesn't necessarily indicate the Anunnaki specifically, that without accompanying text identifying the figures by name, we cannot definitively assign them to any particular group within the Mesopotamian pantheon. But this explanation fails when you map the visual vocabulary systematically. Divine councils in Mesopotamian art typically show gods in differentiated poses, standing, seated, gesturing, multiple tiers indicating hierarchy, symbolic objects identifying individual deities by their specific domains. The visual language communicates variety, individuality, distinct identity. VA 243 shows none of that. 7 identical figures, same posture, same scale, no individualizing features, no symbolic objects distinguishing one from another. The uniformity is absolute, and that uniformity matches no other council configuration in the visual record except in contexts explicitly associated with judgment and the Anunnaki. More significantly, the 7-figure configuration appears consistently across multiple seals from different periods and regions, always in judicial contexts, always with a supplicant or defendant before them, always with the same formal arrangement. The pattern isn't random. It's systematic. And when we find seals that include identifying text alongside the imagery, the ones with 7 judge configurations consistently reference underworld scenes or fate-decreeing contexts. The visual vocabulary has a specific meaning that the archaeological evidence documents repeatedly. 7 identical figures in judgment configuration equals the Anunnaki, which means VA 243 documents something the mythological texts rarely address directly. The Anunnaki judged the living, not just the dead passing through the underworld, not just gods who violated cosmic boundaries, but ordinary human beings while still alive, still terrestrial, still operating in the world above. The kneeling figure is clearly human. The proportions, the posture, the lack of divine attributes all indicate mortal status, and the figure is depicted mid-judgment. The scene captures the moment of evaluation, the 7 figures looking down, the human waiting for the verdict. What was this person being judged for? The seal doesn't specify. What was the outcome? The image doesn't reveal it. But the scene confirms that judgment by the Anunnaki wasn't confined to a specific realm or a specific moment after death. It was ongoing, continuous, potentially applicable to anyone at any time, which transforms the nature of the fear associated with them. If judgment only occurred after death, during the passage to the underworld, you could at least live your terrestrial life with some sense of distance from that final accounting. Death was the threshold. Until then, you were outside the Anunnaki's immediate jurisdiction. But if they could judge the living, there was no safe distance, no moment when you were definitely outside their range. The possibility of being called to account existed at all times, not because you had committed a specific crime, but because the judgment system operated continuously, processing cases as they arose. The bureaucratic model becomes even more precise here. Think of an auditing system that reviews accounts on a rolling basis. Most accounts are never flagged. Most operations proceed without intervention, but the auditing system is always active, always evaluating, always capable of initiating a review if discrepancies appear. The Anunnaki function that way, present but not constantly visible, operating in the background, processing the maintenance of cosmic order without announcing each individual action. And, occasionally, when a boundary was violated or a decree was challenged, they became directly visible. They assembled, they judged, they executed the verdict, for the living as well as the dead. The text doesn't say when the judgment happens. The image doesn't specify the criteria. The evidence simply confirms it occurs. That terrestrial existence didn't exempt anyone from the judgment system, that the 7 figures weren't confined to the underworld despite their later association with it. They were wherever judgment was required, whenever a decree needed enforcement, wherever the system detected a violation. So when did the judgment happen? The answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity. It never stopped. Judgment wasn't an event that occurred at specific ritual moments or specific locations. It was a continuous function. The Anunnaki, as the permanent court, always in session, always reviewing, always ready to process the next case. You couldn't prepare for it because you didn't know when you might be called. You couldn't appeal it because the verdict was immediate and final. You couldn't avoid it because it operated in every realm, every context, every moment of existence. The only response available was to not violate the boundaries, to not challenge the decrees, to not commit actions that would require processing. And even that wasn't a guarantee, because the next piece of evidence reveals the most disturbing administrative detail preserved in any ancient text, something that transforms judgment from an event into a mechanism of existence itself. Claim. Number 5. The name erasure clause. The Era epic, composed during the Old Babylonian period and preserved in multiple later copies, tells the story of Era, a plague god, devastating Mesopotamia during a period when Marduk temporarily abandons his duties as king of the gods. It's a complex text dealing with divine politics, urban destruction, and the restoration of cosmic order. But Tablet 4, preserved in a Neo-Assyrian copy catalogued as K.3473+ in the British Museum, contains a passage that operates on a different level entirely. Lines 50 through 52 describe the extent of the Anunnaki's power using language that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian mythology. The text states they can erase the name from the tablet of life, not kill, not destroy in the sense of physical violence, erase, remove a record, delete an entry. The language is administrative, not martial, and it refers to a tablet, a record-keeping device, a ledger where names are written and, apparently, can be removed. The tablet of life isn't a metaphor in this context. It's presented as a literal document, part of the divine bureaucratic infrastructure that tracks existence itself, and the Anunnaki have the authority to edit it. This breaks the standard timeline because it suggests death wasn't a natural process or even a divine punishment. It was a clerical action, the removal of a name from an official record, and once the name was erased, the corresponding existence terminated. Not because of violence or judgment in the sense of cosmic justice, but because the administrative record no longer recognized that entity as valid. Think of it as database deletion. The name exists in the system. The system maintains the existence. The name is removed. The system no longer supports that existence. The entity ceases. The mainstream explanation treats this as metaphorical language. Death as the ultimate bureaucratic action, expressed through imagery familiar to a society that used written records extensively. The tablet of life is poetic, a way of conveying the finality of death through administrative vocabulary. But this explanation fails when you examine parallel contexts in actual Mesopotamian administrative texts. Temple records and royal annals use identical tablet erasure language when describing the decommissioning of officials. When a priest was removed from office, the scribes documented it as erasing the name from the tablet of service. When a landowner lost property rights, the legal record stated the name was erased from the boundary tablet. When a king delegitimized a previous ruler's reign, the annals describe erasing the name from the tablet of years. The vocabulary wasn't poetic. It was technical. It described the specific administrative action of removing an entry from an official record, which then invalidated whatever status that entry had maintained. And here it is, applied to existence itself. The Anunnaki can erase your name from the tablet that maintains life, which means life, in this theological framework, wasn't an inherent property of a being. It was a status maintained by bureaucratic record. You existed because your name was written. You ceased because your name was erased. The terror isn't violence. The terror is administrative precision. The terror is discovering that existence itself functions like a database, and there are entities with delete privileges. The era epic presents this as established fact, not as a special power era is requesting, not as an extraordinary measure requiring divine approval, as something the Anunnaki simply do, as part of their standard operational parameters, which transforms every other reference to their judgment into something more precise. When they decreed Inanna's fate, they weren't pronouncing a death sentence in the sense of ordering an execution. They were processing a name erasure. When they judged the living, as shown in VA 243, they were potentially reviewing whether that name should remain in the active registry, judgment as database maintenance, existence as a ledger entry subject to periodic review. And here's what makes this particularly unsettling. We have no text that describes who writes the names in the first place. No creation myth that shows the tablet of life being compiled. No ritual text explaining how a name gets added when a child is born or a deity is recognized. We only have documentation of removal, of erasure, of the negative administrative action. The system exists. Names are in it. The Anunnaki can remove them. Everything else is inference. We don't know if the tablet is comprehensive or selective. We don't know if every human name is recorded or only certain ones. We don't know if the tablet tracks duration or simply maintains current status. The text states the power. The text doesn't explain the mechanism. Too organized to be myth, too strange to be history, cannot confirm and cannot dismiss. But the pattern holds. The Anunnaki operate at the intersection of existence and record-keeping. They maintain the system that determines what continues and what ceases, not through power in the traditional sense of force or violence, but through access to the administrative infrastructure that defines reality itself. You can fight an enemy with weapons. You can flee from a threat with geography. You can hide from surveillance with secrecy. But you cannot escape a system that maintains existence through documentation, because to exist outside the system would mean being erased from the record, which is the same as ceasing to exist. The only option was to remain recorded, to keep your name in the tablet, to never commit an action that would trigger an erasure review, to hope that the seven figures never had cause to examine your entry. And even that hope was compromised by a deeper question. If death was name erasure, were the names written somewhere first? Was there a source document, an original registry from which the tablet of life was derived? The answer appears in a colophon no one wanted to translate, because what it implies about the system is worse than execution. Worse than judgment, worse than erasure. It implies the system has no author. Claim Mr. 6, the Tablet of Destinies problem. The Tablet of Destinies appears across multiple Mesopotamian mythological texts as the physical object that contains or controls cosmic authority. Tup Shamati in Akkadian, the tablet upon which the fates of gods and mortals are written. Possession of this tablet grants the holder supreme authority over the universe, control over reality itself, and it gets stolen. Repeatedly. In the Ansu epic, the bird demon Ansu steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while the god bathes. Cosmic order collapses immediately. The stolen tablet renders all divine commands inoperative. Ninurta, the warrior god, must retrieve it through combat. In the Enuma Elish, the tablets are held by Tiamat, transferred to Chingu, then seized by Marduk after he defeats the chaos goddess. In later variations, other figures attempt to claim it or challenge its authority. The theft of the universe's command interface should trigger immediate judicial response. If the Anunnaki are the enforcement mechanism for cosmic order, theft of the order itself should fall directly under their jurisdiction. Yet in none of these theft narratives do the Anunnaki appear to adjudicate the crime. They're absent completely. This breaks the standard timeline because it reveals a boundary to their authority that the texts never explicitly define. The Anunnaki judge violations of law. They execute decrees. They maintain the system. But they don't protect the system from external threats. They don't defend the tablet of destinies. They don't prosecute its theft. Which suggests a distinction the texts assume the reader understands. The Anunnaki enforce what the tablet decrees. They don't enforce protection of the tablet itself. The mainstream explanation treats this as a natural division of labor within a complex pantheon. Different gods handle different crises. Ninurta and Marduk are warrior gods equipped for combat. The Anunnaki are judicial gods equipped for judgment. It makes sense that combat-related problems would be solved by combat-capable deities, while judicial problems would be processed by the judgment system. But this explanation fails when you examine what counts as judicial versus what counts as combat in other contexts. When Inanna trespasses into the underworld, that's treated as a judicial matter requiring the Anunnaki's intervention. When Gilgamesh rejects Ishtar's advances and kills the Bull of Heaven, that's treated as a divine conflict requiring direct punishment. But theft of the Tablet of Destinies, which determines all authority, including the Anunnaki's own enforcement capacity, receives no judicial processing. The pattern suggests the Anunnaki don't protect law. They execute it. They judge violations of established order, but they have no capacity to act when the order itself is compromised at the root level. Think of a court system that can prosecute crimes but cannot defend itself from revolution. It can process violations within the system, but if someone seizes the Constitution itself, the court has no mechanism to respond, because the court doesn't create authority. It administers authority that comes from elsewhere. The Anunnaki judge according to what the Tablet of Destinies decrees. If someone steals the tablet, there's nothing to judge according to. The system doesn't shut down entirely, but its highest level functions become inoperable. The Anunnaki can still process routine cases, still maintain local order, still execute sentences for violations they've already documented. But they can't initiate new judgments based on the theft itself, because judging the theft would require consulting the tablet to determine what decree applies. And the tablet is what was stolen. The texts never state this directly. They simply show it through absence. The Anunnaki don't appear in the tablet theft narratives. The crisis is resolved through combat and negotiation, not judicial procedure. Order is restored by force, not by processing the thief through the seven-figure court, which reveals something fundamental about the structure of divine authority in Mesopotamian theology. There are at least two layers: the legislative layer, which creates and contains the decrees, and the judicial layer, which enforces those decrees. The Anunnaki operate exclusively in the judicial layer. They don't make law. They don't protect law. They execute law. And when the law itself becomes contested at the highest level, they become functionally irrelevant, not because they lack power, but because their power is derivative. It comes from the system, not from independent divine authority. This explains why they appear in moments of finality rather than moments of crisis. Crisis requires improvisation, strategy, adaptation. The theft of the Tablet of Destinies is a crisis. The gods must figure out how to respond, who will retrieve it, what tactics will work. That's not the Anunnaki's domain, but once the crisis resolves, once the tablet is recovered and order is re-established, if there are violations to process, the Anunnaki would return to relevance, judgment of those who supported Anzu, judgment of entities who took advantage of the chaos, processing the backlog of cases that accumulated while the system was compromised. That's their function. Case processing, not emergency response. The texts assume this distinction is obvious. They don't explain why the Anunnaki don't defend the tablet, because the question wouldn't have occurred to an ancient reader. Of course, the judges don't fight. Judges judge. Warriors fight. The roles are separate. But what modern readers miss is the implication about the origin of the Anunnaki's authority. If they can't protect the source of decrees, they're not the source themselves. They're processors, executors, the mechanism through which decisions made elsewhere are implemented, which raises the question the texts circle around without answering directly. If the Tablet of Destinies contains the decrees, and the Anunnaki execute the decrees, who writes the decrees in the first place? Who decides what goes on the tablet? Who determines which boundaries exist and which violations require judgment? Who established the system that the Anunnaki maintain? The answer should appear in creation myths, in texts describing the origin of cosmic order, in narratives explaining how divine authority was first distributed. But when you look at those texts carefully, something strange happens. The authorities are listed. The distributions are documented. The gods receive their assignments. But the author of the system itself remains unnamed. The source of the decrees isn't identified. The Tablet of Destinies exists, and someone possesses it and people fight over it. But who wrote it? Who created the tablet that defines reality? Who established the legal framework that makes judgment possible? The texts don't say. They skip over that question, as if the answer is too obvious to state, or too dangerous, or too fundamental to articulate without destabilizing the entire theological framework. And there's one text where that absence becomes explicitly documented, a colophon that should credit authorship, but instead leaves the source blank. A record that should explain origin, but instead remains silent. Claim. 7. The colophon silence. The Sumerian king list is one of the most important chronological documents from ancient Mesopotamia. It catalogues the dynasties that ruled various city-states from the mythological past through the historical present. It begins with kingship descending from heaven after the flood and traces the succession of rulers through multiple cities across centuries. The Larsa copy, catalogued as WB 444 in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, dates to approximately 1800 BCE during the Old Babylonian period. Like most exemplars of the king list, it includes a colophon. a scribal notation at the end of the document stating its purpose and, typically, its divine authorization. The colophon states that kingship descended from heaven with divine approval. That rule was granted by the gods to certain cities and dynasties. That the succession documented in the list reflects cosmic will implemented through terrestrial governance. But for the first 3 dynasties listed, no approving deity is named. The pattern is consistent across all surviving copies of the king list. Later dynasties include explicit divine sponsors. The text states that a particular god granted kingship to a particular city or confirmed a particular ruler's legitimacy. Enlil approves Uru and sanctions Uruk. Inanna blesses certain kings with military success. But the earliest dynasties, the ones closest to the mythological origin point when kingship first descended from heaven, receive no named divine sponsor. The approval exists. The authorization is documented. The legitimacy is confirmed. But the authorizing deity is absent from the record. This breaks the standard timeline because divine legitimization in Mesopotamian political theology always required a named sponsor. Kings didn't claim vague divine favor. They claimed specific divine relationships. Hammurabi is chosen by Marduk. Gudea receives instructions from Ningirsu. Sargon is blessed by Ishtar. The specificity mattered because it established which divine power backed which terrestrial authority. Without a named sponsor, the legitimacy becomes structural rather than relational. The kingship is valid not because a god chose the king, but because the system recognizes the kingship as valid. The approval comes from the framework itself, not from a personality within the framework. The mainstream explanation treats the missing names as a textual problem. The colophon was damaged. The information was lost during transmission. Earlier dynasties were too distant chronologically for the compilers to remember which gods had sponsored them, so they left the divine attribution blank rather than invent one. But this explanation fails when you examine textual consistency across multiple copies. The king list survives in over a dozen exemplars from different cities and different periods. All of them show the same pattern. Later dynasties have named divine sponsors. Early dynasties don't. The absence isn't random scribal error. It's systematic. And, more significantly, Mesopotamian scribes were perfectly comfortable inventing divine attributions when necessary. Mythological texts regularly assign actions to gods retroactively. Kings claim divine ancestry centuries after their deaths. Temple hymns attribute ancient foundations to gods who became prominent only in later periods. There's no cultural prohibition against filling in missing divine information. Yet here, across multiple copies and centuries of transmission, the compilers consistently leave the early divine sponsor blank, as if the absence itself was important, as if stating that kingship descended from heaven with approval, but without a named approver, was the accurate way to document what happened. The approval exists. The approver doesn't. Or rather, the approver never needed a name, because the approver wasn't an individual deity with preferences and relationships. The approver was the system, the structure, the framework that recognized kingship as a valid category and granted it legitimacy by processing it through the proper channels. This returns us to the Anunnaki's function. They execute decrees, but they don't create decrees. They enforce decisions, but they don't make decisions. They process cases according to established protocol, but the protocol exists prior to their involvement. The early king list colophon suggests the same structural principle applied at the highest level. Authority flowed from the system, not from individual divine will. And if you asked who ran the system, who created it, who maintained the framework that made everything else possible, the answer was structurally identical to asking who sponsored the first kings. Someone did. Something did. The approval was real. The authorization functioned. But the source had no name, or no name that could be written, or no name that the scribes were willing to write. The Anunnaki appear in the records the same way, present in function, absent in origin, processing cases without individual identity, 7 figures performing a role that predates explanation, too organized to be myth, too strange to be history, cannot confirm and cannot dismiss. The record documents the system. The record remains silent about the system's author. And that silence creates a gap in the evidence that feels deliberate, as if there's information the texts know but won't state directly, as if the question of origin is something you're supposed to infer rather than something anyone would explicitly document, which leads to the most precise piece of evidence about the Anunnaki's structure, not their origin, which remains undocumented, but their configuration, the specific number that appears consistently across 2,000 years of sources, 7, not 6, not 8, not a variable group that changes size depending on circumstances. 7 judges, 7 figures, 7 allocations in the ration lists, 7 gates in the underworld, each with 1 judge stationed, 7 seats in the divine court. Why 7? If this was symbolic, Mesopotamian culture had clearer symbolic numbers: 3 for completeness, 4 for cardinal directions, 12 for zodiacal completeness, 60 for mathematical perfection. 7 appears rarely in Mesopotamian sacred contexts, except in connection with the Anunnaki, which suggests it wasn't symbolic. It was functional. 7 because the process required 7 stages. 7 because the judgment architecture needed 7 positions. 7 because that's how many it took to make the system work. Claim. 8. The 7-function architecture among the fragmentary tablets recovered from the Neo-Assyrian library at Nineveh, catalogued as K.2100 in the British Museum, is a damaged liturgical text that includes a phrase pattern appearing nowhere else in surviving Mesopotamian literature. 7 gates, 7 judges, 7 decrees. The text is broken. Context is minimal, but the pattern is precise. 3 sevens, 3 parallel structures, each linked to a stage in what appears to be a processional sequence. Gates, which imply passage. Judges, which imply evaluation. Decrees, which imply outcome. 7 of each, in sequence. This breaks the standard timeline because it presents 7 as a procedural requirement rather than a symbolic number. Gates don't exist for symbolic reasons. Gates exist to control passage, to create checkpoints, to separate zones. If there are 7 gates in the underworld, as multiple texts confirm, each gate serves a specific function in controlling access to the realm of the dead. And if there's 1 judge per gate, the judges aren't an arbitrary council. They're a distributed system, each positioned at a specific threshold, each responsible for evaluating passage at that specific point, each capable of issuing a decree relevant to that stage of the process. The 7 judges aren't sitting together in a single courtroom. They're stationed throughout a multi-stage system, and judgment happens sequentially, not collectively. Think of it as a checkpoint architecture. You pass the first gate. The first judge evaluates. A decree is issued either permitting passage or terminating the process. If you pass, you proceed to the second gate. Second judge. Second evaluation. Second decree. The process continues through all 7 stages. Only if you pass all 7 do you reach the final destination. Any failure at any stage terminates the journey. The mainstream explanation treats the 7-gate structure as mythological elaboration. Ancient storytellers created elaborate underworld geographies to make the afterlife journey feel significant. The 7 gates are narrative device, not structural necessity. The 7 judges are poetic multiplication of a single judgment concept. But this explanation fails when you examine how 7 functions in actual Mesopotamian administrative and architectural contexts. 7-stage processes appear in ritual texts describing purification sequences. 7-day cycles appear in economic documents tracking work rotations. 7-tier structures appear in temple construction plans showing hierarchical organization. 7, when it appears in administrative contexts, indicates a complete process cycle, a sequence that requires 7 distinct stages to achieve its intended outcome. Not symbolic completeness, but operational completeness. The thing doesn't work properly unless all 7 stages function. And here's what makes the evidence particularly significant. The 7-gate structure of the underworld is documented independently across multiple sources. The descent of Inanna describes Inanna passing through 7 gates, losing 1 divine power at each gate, arriving before the judges with nothing left to protect her. 7 subtractions, 7 thresholds, 7 moments when something is evaluated and removed, and then the 7 judges, who don't judge once collectively, but represent the culmination of a 7-stage evaluation that's already occurred. By the time you stand before the Anunnaki, you've already passed through 7 checkpoints. You've already been evaluated 7 times. You've already had 7 decrees issued about your passage. The final judgment isn't the beginning of evaluation. It's the end. The processing of someone who has successfully or unsuccessfully navigated the entire system. The determination of what happens now that the 7-stage journey is complete. This transforms the Anunnaki from judges in the conventional sense to case finalizers. They don't investigate. They don't gather evidence. They don't debate guilt or innocence. By the time someone reaches them, all of that has already happened through the 7-stage progression. Their function is to execute the outcome that the system has already determined, to pronounce the decree that follows necessarily from having completed or failed the 7-stage process, to finalize what the architecture has already evaluated. Not a mystical 7, a procedural 7. As if judgment required passing through multiple checkpoints, none optional, each building on the previous stage's determination, which explains why their judgment is immediate, why there's no deliberation, why the verdict is pronounced without discussion or appeal. They're not determining the outcome. They're documenting the outcome that the system has already produced. The 7 gates evaluated you. The 7 judges stationed at those gates Each made their determination. The 7 decrees accumulated into a final status, and when you reach the Anunnaki, they simply state what that accumulated status means for your continued existence or your erasure from the tablet of life. The terror isn't cruelty. The terror is efficiency. The terror is discovering that you were being evaluated at every stage of the journey and didn't realize it, that each gate you passed was making a permanent record, that each checkpoint was narrowing your options, that by the time you reach the final court, your fate has already been determined by the architecture you moved through. The Anunnaki don't decide. They declare. They don't choose. They confirm. They don't create outcomes. They execute outcomes that the 7-stage system has already calculated. And if that's their function, then the 7-judge configuration isn't about having enough judges for fair deliberation. It's about having one representative for each stage, one voice, speaking on behalf of each checkpoint, one decree from each gate. The collective judgment is the sum of the individual evaluations you've already undergone. The 7 figures aren't debating your case. They're each reporting what their gate determined. And when all 7 reports align, when all 7 decrees point to the same conclusion, that conclusion becomes your fate. Immediate. Final. Without appeal. Because you can't appeal a mechanical process. You can't argue with a checkpoint that already let you through or stopped you. You can't negotiate with gates that have already measured you against their specific criteria. You can only hope you pass all 7. And if you don't, the Anunnaki's judgment is just the formal documentation of the failure that already occurred somewhere in the sequence, which raises a question the texts hint at but never fully explore. What happens when the system malfunctions? What happens when the 7-stage process breaks down? When gates fail to function? When judges fail to evaluate? When the architecture itself becomes compromised? One text shows us exactly that. And what it reveals is worse than execution, worse than judgment, worse than erasure. It reveals that when the system fails, there is no backup, no redundancy, no higher authority to restore function. The system is absolute precisely because nothing exists above it to repair it when it breaks. Claim number 9. The malfunction record. The Nergal and Ereshkigal myth exists in multiple versions, but the Amarna version, discovered among the diplomatic correspondence at Tel El Amarna in Egypt and catalogued as EA 357, contains a scene that appears in no other Mesopotamian text describing divine judgment, the Anunnaki malfunction. The narrative context is a conflict between Nergal, a god of plague and war, and Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Nergal violates underworld protocol, eventually forcing his way into Ereshkigal's throne room through violence and intimidation. The cosmic order of the underworld, which had functioned continuously since its establishment, is disrupted by a god who refuses to follow procedure. And in Tablet the Sud, lines 47 through 51, the text describes the Anunnaki's response. They don't fight back. They don't retreat to a defensive position. They don't appeal to higher divine authority. The text states they sit in confusion. The Akkadian phrase is Ina shitkulti ushbu. Literally, in disorientation, they sit, paralyzed, unable to process what's happening. The judgment system encountering a situation it has no protocol for handling. This breaks the standard timeline, because it's the only text in the entire Mesopotamian corpus where the Anunnaki fail to function. In every other appearance, they operate with mechanical precision, immediate judgment, instant decree, flawless execution. But here, confronted with divine disruption that doesn't follow the expected patterns, they simply stop. Not strategically, not as a tactical withdrawal. They stop because the system doesn't know what to do with input it wasn't designed to process. The mainstream explanation treats this as standard mythological conflict narrative. Gods fight. Cosmic order is temporarily disrupted. Eventually, order is restored through negotiation or victory. The Anunnaki's confusion is just narrative color showing how serious the disruption was. If even the underworld judges are confused, the crisis must be significant. But this explanation fails when you compare this scene to other divine conflicts in Mesopotamian mythology. When Marduk fights Tiamat, the gods watching don't sit in confusion. They take sides, offer support, celebrate victory. When Ninurta battles Anzu, the divine witnesses remain actively engaged, strategic, responsive to developments. The Anunnaki don't strategize. They don't take sides. They don't adapt. They sit in confusion because the situation has moved outside the parameters they're designed to handle. Nergal isn't violating a specific law that can be processed. He's disrupting the infrastructure itself. And when infrastructure breaks, the systems dependent on that infrastructure can't function. Think of a computer program encountering corrupted data. It doesn't improvise a solution. It crashes, displays an error message, waits for external intervention to restore proper input conditions. The Anunnaki sit, confused, waiting, unable to process. Because judgment requires a functioning system, and the system is currently compromised by actions that violate its foundational assumptions. They can judge violations within the system, but they cannot respond to attacks on the system itself. They're case processors, not security forces. They have no offensive capability, no defensive protocols, no contingency plans for this scenario. Because the scenario shouldn't be possible. Gods should follow divine order. The underworld should remain inviolate. The structure should maintain itself through the weight of cosmic authority. The fact that Nergal can simply force his way in and disrupt everything suggests the system has no hard defenses. It has judgment capacity. But judgment only works when the judged entity accepts the authority of the process. When someone rejects that authority entirely and acts through force, judgment becomes irrelevant. You can't decree someone's fate when they're actively destroying the mechanism that enforces decrees. The text doesn't describe the Anunnaki recovering on their own. They remain in disorientation until Nergal and Ereshkigal negotiate a resolution, until the conflict is resolved through means external to the judgment system, until the infrastructure stabilizes enough that normal processing can resume, which reveals the ultimate limitation. When the system breaks, there's no backup, no redundancy, no higher court to appeal to, no override mechanism that restores function. The Anunnaki can't judge themselves back to operational status. They can't execute a decree that repairs the system they're part of. They just stop, and they wait, and they hope that whatever is disrupting cosmic order will be resolved by forces outside their jurisdiction. Too organized to be myth, unless organization itself is the vulnerability. unless the efficiency that makes the system work under normal conditions becomes fragility under abnormal ones, unless the same mechanical precision that makes judgment immediate and final also makes the judges incapable of adaptation when confronted with the unprecedented. The Anunnaki sit in confusion, not because they're cowardly, not because they're weak, but because confusion is the system's response to encountering conditions it wasn't designed for. And, unlike the gods who fight or flee or negotiate, the Anunnaki have no protocols outside their core function. They judge, they decree, they execute. And when circumstances prevent those functions, they stop, as if someone pulled the power supply, as if the program encountered an exception and halted execution, as if the machinery simply cannot operate outside its designed parameters. And here's what makes this evidence impossible to dismiss. The text treats their confusion as natural, expected, not as a shocking failure that requires explanation. The narrative presents it as what obviously happens when you disrupt underworld order. The judges stop working. Obviously, because they're not independent agents with free will and creative problem-solving capacity. They're a system, and systems don't improvise. They run, or they don't. They function, or they crash. There's no middle ground where they sort of work or partially function or creatively adapt. The 7-stage architecture requires all 7 stages to operate correctly. If one gate fails, if one checkpoint malfunctions, if one decree cannot be issued, the entire sequence becomes compromised. And if the entire sequence is compromised, the final judgment cannot occur. The case cannot be processed. The fate cannot be decreed. So the Anunnaki sit, in disorientation, waiting for the system to restore itself, or for external intervention to repair what they cannot fix from within, which leads to the final, most uncomfortable piece of evidence, the one that explains why, despite their overwhelming presence in mythology, despite their central role in divine and mortal fate, despite their appearance in texts spanning 2,000 years, one thing never appears in the archaeological record: worship. Claim. Durgur 10. The Temple Absence. Archaeological surveys of major Mesopotamian cities have documented thousands of temples, shrines, and cultic installations across multiple millennia. Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Babylon, Assur. Sites occupied continuously from the 4th millennium BCE through the 1st millennium CE. Layers of construction, reconstruction, renovation, expansion. Temple complexes that grew to dominate entire city districts. The evidence includes foundation deposits naming patron deities, dedicatory inscriptions describing temple construction, offering lists documenting regular provisions to gods, priesthood rosters showing cultic personnel, festival calendars marking ritual celebrations, architectural features designed for specific divine functions. We have temples to An, the sky god, temples to Enlil, king of the gods, temples to Enki, god of wisdom, temples to Inanna, goddess of war and love, temples to Nana, moon god, temples to Utu, sun god, temples to Ninhursag, mother goddess, even temples to underworld deities. Ereshkigal has temple evidence. Nergal has cultic installations. Gods associated with death, disease, and the underworld receive worship infrastructure. But across 2,600 years of continuous occupation and intensive archaeological investigation, there is zero evidence of temples dedicated to the Anunnaki, zero shrines bearing their collective name, 0 cultic personnel bearing titles related to their service, 0 festival days marking their honor, 0 offering lists specifying provisions for the Anunnaki as a group. They appear in every major mythological text. They judge gods and mortals. They decree fates that alter cosmic history. They execute sentences on deities. They appear on cylinder seals. They're mentioned in royal inscriptions. They're referenced in wisdom literature. And they have no cult, no worship, no religious infrastructure whatsoever. This breaks the standard timeline, because major divine figures in Mesopotamian religion always had cultic expression. Worship wasn't optional for gods who mattered. It was the primary way divine importance manifested in the terrestrial realm. If a god was significant in mythology, that god received temples, priesthoods, festivals, offerings. The correlation was absolute. Divine prominence in texts equals cultic prominence in archaeology, except for the Anunnaki, who violate that correlation completely. The mainstream explanation attempts to resolve this by arguing that underworld deities received indirect worship, that offerings made to Ereshkigal or Nergal would have included provisions for their underworld retinue, including the Anunnaki. That subterranean deities didn't need surface temples because their realm was inherently below ground, but this explanation fails when you examine the evidence for other underworld deities. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, has clear archaeological evidence of cultic worship. Shrines at Kutha, offering lists specifying provisions to her by name, priesthoods dedicated to her service. She's an underworld deity, but she receives surface worship. Nergal, king of the underworld, has temple complexes, festival days, royal patronage. Kings claim his favor. Cities identify him as patron deity. He operates in the underworld, but he receives explicit terrestrial worship. Even minor underworld figures show cultic traces. Demons and protective spirits have apotropaic inscriptions. Guardian figures at gates have dedicatory texts. Entities associated with death and judgment receive acknowledgement, propitiation, ritual attention. The Anunnaki receive nothing, and the absence is too consistent across too many sites and too many centuries to be accidental. This isn't missing evidence. This is evidence of absence, the kind of systematic absence that indicates intentional structure rather than random gaps in the archaeological record. They weren't worshipped because they weren't gods, in the sense that required worship. They were infrastructure. They were the mechanism by which divine judgment operated. And you don't worship mechanisms. You don't build temples to court systems. You don't create priesthoods to serve bureaucratic processes. You use them. You're processed by them. You hope to avoid triggering their attention, but you don't worship them. Think about how Mesopotamians actually interacted with divine authority. You worshipped patron deities to gain favor. You made offerings to specific gods to secure blessing, protection, success. You participated in festivals to maintain cosmic order and ensure the continued functioning of agriculture, kingship, and social stability. Worship was transactional, relational, an exchange between mortal devotion and divine benefit. It assumed the deity had preferences, could be influenced, might respond differently based on the quality or quantity of offerings received. The Anunnaki had none of that. You couldn't influence their judgment through offerings. You couldn't earn their favor through devotion. You couldn't negotiate with them through ritual. Their function was mechanical, not relational. They processed cases according to established protocol. Offerings were irrelevant to that processing, so no temples were built, because temples exist to facilitate worship, and worship exists to influence divine will, and the Anunnaki had no will to influence. They had protocols, and protocols don't change based on how many offerings you provide. This explains the fear. Not fear of cruel gods who might hurt you despite your devotion. Fear of a system that would process you regardless of your devotion. Fear of facing judges who wouldn't consider your prayers, your sacrifices, your relationships with other gods. Fear of discovering that when you stood before the seven figures, nothing you had done in life to secure divine favor would matter, because they didn't evaluate relationships. They evaluated violations. And if a violation had occurred, if a boundary had been crossed, if a decree had been challenged, the judgment would proceed mechanically. No amount of worship could change that. So worship didn't exist, because it would have been pointless. The archaeological record documents this understanding perfectly. Every god who could be influenced has temples. Every deity whose favor could be secured through ritual has cultic infrastructure. And the Anunnaki, who couldn't be influenced and whose judgment couldn't be avoided, have nothing. Omnipresent in mythology, absent in archaeology. Not because they weren't important, because their importance was structural rather than relational. They were the system, and you don't worship the system. You're processed by it, cannot confirm and cannot dismiss. But the pattern holds across every source. The texts describe them, the ration lists provision them, the myths show them judging, the seals depict them assembled, and the archaeological record shows no worship infrastructure because their function required none. They weren't recipients of devotion. They were the mechanism by which cosmic order was maintained. And mechanisms don't require temples. They require only that the system remain functional enough to keep processing cases. Which brings us to the final question. The one the evidence circles but never directly answers. The one that sits in the silence between all these documented facts. What were the Anunnaki, really? Not gods, in the sense ancient Mesopotamians worshipped gods. Not demons, in the sense of malevolent spirits seeking human harm. Not mythological inventions created to explain death or suffering or cosmic injustice. Something else. Something the texts document with administrative precision but never quite define. 7 figures who process cases according to established protocols. Who execute decrees derived from sources they don't control. Who maintain a system they didn't create and can't repair when it breaks. The evidence suggests they were the bureaucratic apparatus of cosmic order given divine names. Judgment as an administrative function, not a moral action. Fate as a case-processing outcome, not a narrative destiny. Death as ledger entry deletion, not personal tragedy. The fear that ancient Mesopotamians felt toward the Anunnaki wasn't fear of cruelty or malice. It was fear of encountering power that operates without personality, without appeal, without exception. Fear of discovering that beneath the named gods who could be worshipped and influenced, there was a layer of mechanical enforcement that cared nothing for worship or influence. Fear of the system itself. Modern readers struggle with this because we expect ancient religions to be about relationship with the divine. We expect worship to mean affection, devotion, personal connection. We expect gods to be personalities with whom you can negotiate, plead, or bargain. But Mesopotamian religion, at its deepest structural level, recognized something else: real power, absolute power, cosmic power that actually determines outcomes, is not safe to approach. It's not relational. It's not personal. It operates according to its own logic, indifferent to human need or human pain. And if you violate its boundaries or challenge its decrees, you will be processed, not punished. Processed. There's a difference. Punishment implies a punisher with emotions, with a sense of justice, with varying severity based on circumstances. Processing is mechanical. You either pass the checkpoints or you don't. You either remain in the registry or you're erased. The system evaluates. The system determines. The system executes. And the seven figures who sit in the final court aren't there to add wisdom or mercy or consideration. They're there to document the outcome that the seven-stage evaluation has already produced, to pronounce the fate that the checkpoints have already calculated, to execute the decree that follows necessarily from the accumulated determinations you've undergone. The jurisdictional gap from claim number 1. The Anunnaki held no portfolio because they weren't part of the distributed divine economy. They were the enforcement mechanism that predated and enabled that distribution. The ration allocations from claim number 2. 7 portions recorded before the myths were written because accountants were tracking an operational system, not imagining mythological figures. The execution protocol from claim number 3. Legal language applied to divine judgment because the judgment actually followed legal procedure, not because the storytellers were being metaphorical. The living judgment from claim number 4. Depicted on seals because terrestrial existence was under continuous evaluation, not just posthumous review. The name erasure clause from claim number 5. Death as administrative action because existence itself was maintained through bureaucratic record-keeping. The Tablet of Destiny's problem from claim number 6. The Anunnaki absent from its theft because they execute law rather than protect it. The colophon silence from claim number 7. Early divine sponsors unnamed because legitimacy came from the system, not from individual divine will. The 7-function architecture from claim number 8. Not symbolic mysticism, but procedural necessity, a checkpoint system requiring 7 stages. The malfunction record from claim number 9. Confusion when disrupted because systems crash when encountering input outside their parameters. The temple absence from claim number 10. No worship infrastructure because they weren't recipients of devotion, but mechanisms of enforcement. Each claim builds on the previous. Each piece of evidence confirms the pattern. Too organized to be myth. Too strange to be history. Cannot confirm what they were. Cannot dismiss what they did. But we can recognize the fear, because we still feel it, in different forms, with different names, but the same structural terror. The fear of bureaucratic systems that process you without seeing you. The fear of algorithmic judgment that operates without appeal. The fear of standing before mechanisms that don't care about your story, your context, your humanity. The fear of discovering that underneath all the named authorities, all the relationships, all the negotiations, there's a layer of absolute enforcement that treats you as a case number, a file to process, an entry to evaluate, a name that might be erased if the checkpoints determine you've violated boundaries you may not have known existed. The Anunnaki terrified ancient Mesopotamians, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed something about the structure of reality itself. That order, real order, the kind that actually determines who continues and who ceases, operates mechanically, without personality, without mercy or cruelty, just protocols, checkpoints, determinations, decrees. And once you understood that, once you recognized what the seven figures actually represented, worship became pointless. You couldn't pray your way out of systematic evaluation. You couldn't offer your way past checkpoints. You could only hope that when the seven-stage process evaluated your existence, you would pass all seven gates. And if you didn't, the Anunnaki would document your failure with administrative precision. They would pronounce the fate that the system had already determined. They would erase your name from the tablet of life, not in anger, not in judgment in the moral sense, but in execution of protocol, in processing of the case, in finalization of the determination that the architecture had already made. The clay tablets remain. The evidence sits in museum catalogs. The cuneiform can be read by anyone with linguistic training. The archaeological surveys are published. The temple absence is documented. The ration lists are preserved. The legal vocabulary is translated. The seven-gate structure is mapped, and the seven figures still wait, unnamed in the earliest records, mechanically precise in every appearance, processing cases according to protocols no text fully explains, executing decrees derived from sources no colophon identifies. The record remains silent on whether the system was built or discovered, whether someone created the judgment architecture, or whether it emerged from the structure of cosmic order itself, whether the Anunnaki were assigned their function, or whether they simply are that function given form. The texts don't answer. They only document. 7 figures, 7 gates, 7 decrees, 7 rations allocated continuously for 15 centuries, 7 checkpoints you must pass, 7 evaluations you cannot avoid, and at the end, when all 7 stages have processed you, the 7 judges sit in assembly. They don't deliberate. They don't debate. They simply declare what the system has already determined. Your fate. Finalized. Decreed. Executed. Not because they chose it, because the architecture calculated it, because the checkpoints measured you, because the protocol demanded it, because you were processed, and the processing reached its conclusion, and that conclusion must now be documented. Too organized to be myth, too strange to be history, too consistent across sources to dismiss, too systematic to be comfortable accepting. The Anunnaki were feared more than they were worshipped, not because the Mesopotamians misunderstood them, but because they understood them perfectly. They understood that beneath all the gods who listened to prayers, there was a system that didn't listen. Beneath all the deities who could be influenced, there was enforcement that couldn't be influenced. Beneath all the relationships that made religion feel personal, there was machinery that operated impersonally. And when you stood before that machinery, when you faced the 7 figures who represented the system itself, all your relationships became irrelevant. All your worship became meaningless. All your prayers became empty, because they didn't judge you. They documented what the system had already determined about you, and that determination was final. The evidence has been here all along, in museum archives, in translated tablets, in archaeological absence, in administrative consistency, in the silence between what the texts say and what they carefully avoid saying. The Anunnaki. 7 figures, no temples, continuous function, mechanical precision, systematic evaluation, bureaucratic execution, not myth, not history, something in between, something we recognize, something we still fear. The system, always processing, always evaluating, always determining who continues and who ceases, not through cruelty but through protocol, not through choice but through calculation. And we, like the ancient Mesopotamians, can only hope we pass all 7 gates.